The Grand Council chamber fell silent as Ambassador Reynolds finished speaking. The 7 alien representatives sat motionless, their varied anatomies frozen in what humans had come to recognize as universal shock. First speaker Tull, with his iridescent skin now a pale blue, was the first to recover. "You mean to tell us that your species has rules? For war?" Reynolds nodded, wondering if perhaps he had misunderstood the question. Of course. Most civilized nations on Earth signed the Geneva Convention centuries ago. The aliens exchanged glances, their translator implants working overtime to process concepts that had no direct equivalents in their languages. The humans had been part of the Galactic Confederation for only 3 standard cycles, and the Council still struggled to comprehend their newest members. "But why would you need rules for something that should never happen?" asked Representative Lorne, her feathery appendages quivering. "War itself is an abomination." Captain Jack Miller, the Marine escort assigned to the human diplomatic team, shifted uncomfortably behind Ambassador Reynolds. He caught Reynolds' subtle hand signal requesting his input. "With respect," Miller began, stepping forward. "Humans have never known a time without conflict. Our rules of war exist because we recognized our own capacity for brutality." The chamber's atmospheric regulators hummed as they compensated for the aliens' increased respiration rates. "Please elaborate, Captain," First Speaker Tull requested, his voice carrying an edge of dread. Miller stood at parade rest, his posture rigid from years of military discipline. Before these rules, armies would target civilians, use chemical weapons that caused prolonged suffering, execute prisoners, and employ torture as standard practice. "And these actions are now forbidden?" asked Representative Keir, the crystalline being from the Aldebaran system. "Yes. They're what we call war crimes," Miller explained. "Acts so heinous that even in our most desperate conflicts, we agreed they cross a moral line." First Speaker Tull leaned forward. "Yet you created these prohibitions because your kind has done these things before?" Miller nodded solemnly. "History is full of examples, yes. The revelation struck the Council members like a physical blow. The Confederation's species had evolved without the constant tribal warfare that shaped human development. Most had achieved space travel before ever developing weapons capable of mass destruction." "There's something you should understand," Ambassador Reynolds interjected, sensing the growing unease. "These conventions represent humanity's conscious rejection of our darkest impulses. They're evidence of our growth, not just our capacity for violence." Representative Lorne's translator struggled to keep up with her rapid speech. "But what prevents humans from ignoring these rules when convenient?" Miller answered before Reynolds could. "Nothing but our own commitment to them. But we've learned that societies that abandon these principles tend to destroy themselves from within." The Council chamber remained silent for several moments. The aliens had welcomed humans to the Confederation, believing them to be a peaceful, if somewhat primitive species. The revelation of humanity's violent history, and their codified attempts to contain it, painted a more complex picture. "We've mistaken your technological limitations for inherent harmlessness," First Speaker Tull finally said. "Your species developed nuclear weapons before reliable interplanetary travel. You created international laws against genocide while still engaging in global conflicts. You are paradoxical." Reynolds smiled diplomatically. "We prefer to think of ourselves as works in progress." The meeting adjourned shortly after, with the alien representatives departing in visible distress. Reynolds and Miller walked slowly back to the human embassy compound. "Do you think we've jeopardized our standing in the Confederation?" Reynolds asked quietly. Miller considered the question. "No, but I think we've just become much more interesting to them." 3 days later, an urgent summons brought the human diplomatic team back to the Council chamber. First Speaker Tull addressed them without preamble. "The Drax hegemony has rejected our diplomatic overtures and is advancing toward Confederation space. They've already subjugated 2 independent worlds along the outer rim." Reynolds exchanged glances with Miller. "The Confederation had no standing military force. Their member species had evolved without it." We request Earth's assistance, Tool continued. Not for your technology, which remains primitive by our standards, but for your expertise. You want military advisors, Miller stated plainly. Yes, Tool admitted. The concept was foreign to us until recently, but the Dracs appear to operate by no recognizable ethical constraints. We need to understand how to engage with such a species. Reynolds carefully considered his response. The Confederation has been clear that it values peace above all else. Are you asking us to help you prepare for war? We're asking you to help us establish boundaries with a species that doesn't recognize them, Tool clarified. Your Geneva Conventions may provide a framework. Miller stepped forward. With respect, first speaker, rules only work when both sides agree to follow them. We understand, Tool replied, but perhaps knowing where the lines should be drawn will help us recognize when they've been crossed and respond accordingly. Reynolds nodded slowly. We'll need to consult with our government, but speaking unofficially, I believe Earth will help. As they left the chamber, Miller walked silently beside the ambassador. Thoughts, Captain? Reynolds finally asked. Miller's expression remained neutral, but his eyes reflected a grim understanding. They thought we were harmless because we're physically weaker and technologically behind. Now they're afraid of us because we understand something they don't. War, Reynolds said. Not just war, Miller corrected. The line between justified defense and unjustified atrocity. They're about to discover that the hardest part isn't fighting, it's knowing when to stop. The two humans walked on in silence, suddenly aware of the weight of responsibility their species now carried. The aliens had assumed humans were harmless, until they realized what humanity had needed to tame within itself. Now the Confederation needed that hard-earned wisdom, and humanity would have to decide how much of their darker knowledge to share with a galaxy that had never needed it before.